let me give you this. This is why I think the beginning of the incel movement and the black pill movement was born out of pickup artistry. The origin, if you trace it back using internet history, of the incel black pill ideology was I think it was a subreddit or a website called PUA Hate, Pickup Artist Hate. And what it was a group of men who had been through the pipeline of pickup artistry, and come out the other side with a very jaded and even more jaded view of the world.
Even more jaded.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. So what happens if a guy learns old school, mid-20 noughts pickup artistry is you realize that there is a particular set of actions, a script that you can run, which makes it more likely that a woman is going to go to bed with you.
Right.
But what you realize when you do that, as you learn how to neg and do kino escalation and tell them that story about the midget fight outside or whatever your script is that you're running, you then begin to see just how far away that person is from the person that you actually show up as.
Right.
Who you are, and this extravagant persona that you need to convolute into existence in order to get this woman into bed makes you feel
worse even.
Feel the gap between where you are and what you have to do in order to achieve the thing that you want. Now, what you don't realize is that there are a million other ways that you could become sufficiently charming to get this person to like you. This is
by actually doing it, for example.
This is just one that happens to be robust and easy enough to write down in a book and easy enough for most guys to replicate.
It's basically a form of scripted psychopathy. So what a psychopath does is feign competence, right? So most psychopaths are very emotionally stable. And so one of the early stage markers for competence is self-possession and calmness. And so if you're not an anxious person, you've got an edge on that already. And most psychopaths are very high in emotional stability. And so they look confident, because confident people tend not to be that nervous. Like if you're doing something you're expert at, well, you're not nervous because you know how to do it. Okay, so the lack of nervousness is a hint to competence. Well, you can feign that. You can feign competence. You can feign confidence. That's what the pickup artists teach. Now, I would say there's even some utility in what they do, right? Because if you're dependent and bitter and resentful and charmless and self-destructive and nervous and socially unskilled, the probability that you're going to be successful with women is very, very low. Okay, so you should be other than who you are. Now, if you start putting on this persona, then you could think about that as a new suit of clothes, and you could learn through that how to fill in the gaps.
Fake it until you make it.
Absolutely, absolutely. But if you take on that without doing the effort necessary to integrate that in a genuine way, then all that's happening is that you're being rewarded for being fake, right? And that's part of the problem with that too, is that you're practicing learning how to manipulate people in a psychopathic way. And if you practice that, of course you're going to become jaded. Like there's nothing more jaded than a psychopath. I mean, that's the ultimate extreme of jadedness. And if you practice manipulating, especially if the women happen to be reasonably good women, if you practice manipulating them and you're successful, then you're learning to be one horrible person. Now, you know, as your completely useless, unproductive, and undesirable former self, you weren't exactly stellar to begin with, but substituting psychopathy for that was sort of like substituting cynicism for naivety. Now, as a complex problem, I mean, part of the reason that people like Andrew Tate are so attractive to young guys is because they do put up that confident, that false confidence. Tate's a complicated guy because it's not all false. You know, real people are complicated the way that like villains in comic books aren't. Tate's a fighter. It's clearly the case that he's got a certain degree of physical bravery. That's real. All right. There's an element of what he says that's very attractive to bedroom basement dwelling losers, because he's at least there out in the world, you know, taken the blows, and he's got a fast car, and he's flashy, and he's attractive to women. But a lot of what he's done, especially with women, doesn't just border into the psychopathic, it crosses the line. And that's not a good model. It's not an optimal model for people who are trying to progress. But it's a strange thing, because just as cynicism is an improvement over naivety, right, the capacity to be dark is an improvement over the lack of ability to be dark at all. And so Tate is attractive in the way that the shadow beckons to people who are undeveloped, right? Because it does. It's like you're neurotic and you're dependent and you're repressed because you're immature and harmless. Well, one way out of that is to stop being harmless. And one of the things you can say about Tate is that he's not harmless. Right. Well, it's a virtue. Now, it's a virtue that has to be bracketed. It's like cynicism is a virtue compared to naivety, but it's not virtuous in and of itself. It's a step on the way. And so maybe you can learn how to feign confidence, and you can learn how that works, and maybe that's an improvement. I had a guy in my clinical practice who got involved with the pickup artist community, and he taught me a lot about it. And one of the exercises that their initiates had to do was to go out and ask 50 women for their phone number in one day. And that's a great exercise, and I'm not
exposure therapy, approach anxiety.
Absolutely. Getting over your fear of rejection, right? Yeah. And 50 times will do that, because you're going to get rejected the vast majority of
50 times.
But, well, likely 50 times. Although generally that wasn't people's experience. You know, if they were even vaguely skilled, they'd at least get a false phone number out of the deal. But then they learned that the rejection wasn't as catastrophic as they thought. But more importantly, they learned that they could continue moving forward in the face of rejection.
So the thing that it makes me think about there is intellectual humility and how tightly people hold on to their beliefs, that if you believe that you are always going to be right, that there is nothing to learn outside of you, and that any kind of admission that you might be wrong is tantamount to destruction, it does exactly the same thing. You need to, and it goes back to asking stupid questions, being prepared to ask the stupid questions and look not like the most informed person in the room, but also importantly, nowhere near the most stupid person in the room, because you're the one that's asking the question.
Well, the stupidest person in the room is the person who doesn't know and won't ask. Or even worse, who doesn't know and won't ask and acts like they know. That's not good at all.
There's from your...
See, that's part of that idea that you should love your enemy. So you might say, well, why should you do that? Well, your enemy is going to be your harshest critic. Now, it's possible that if you have a very good enemy, that he will show you flaws in your character that you didn't know were there. And so it's a very strange way of looking at the world, to think that you should welcome an attack. This is right. I'm saying that with all due caution, let's say. The more vicious the attack, the more of your potential hidden flaws might be revealed.
Have you found that to be true?
Oh, definitely. But I've also found that that attacks force you to contend with it, to see if it's there, right? To test it. I suppose the attacks that have come after me that have been most successful, they're almost always journalists. And they're usually British female journalists, but not always.
We produce a nation of hard-hitting journalists.
Yeah, well, and faith in journalists is the lowest in the UK and anywhere in the Western world. And I can see why, but there's some advantage. There's some real advantage to facing someone. It's a Pharisee problem. In the Gospels, Christ was always contending with these Pharisees. And what the Pharisees were always trying to do was to lay a verbal trap for him. So
is a Pharisee a person?
Pharisee was a Jewish sect. Okay. And the Pharisees were very legalistic in their interpretation of Mosaic law. And so they were hypocritical, the way they're portrayed in the Gospels. And they're hypocritical by the book moralists. And most of their morality was for show. They liked to pray in public. They liked to be seen being holy. At least that's the criticisms that are levied against them. And what they're always trying to do in the gospel accounts is to lay a verbal trap for Christ so that they can expose him as a heretic and kill him, right? So every single thing they say is a snare of some sort. And there's lots of journalists like that. Nellie Bowles, who wrote an article about me for the New York Times, which was a very devastating article in many ways and very serpentine and subtle. She, 3 years later, she wrote another article about what it was like to work for the New York Times when she was working there and the tricks that the journalists played, including her. And she said that the game was to devastate someone else's reputation in the attempt to boost yours, right? So you could think about it as a game of comparative moral standing. So the journalist's trick is to trick you into saying something that will end your career, essentially.
Their social status stands on the shoulders of yours.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so now the advantage to being in a situation like that is that you have to if you step extremely carefully, and you're fortunate, then you evade the traps, and then the interview tilts hard in your favor.
Yeah.
And so the interviews that have done me the most good in the long run were the two interviews that were most hostile. One by Channel's 4,
Griffin,
Kathy Newman.
Kathy Griffin.
And Kathy at least had a sense of humor. Another one by Helen Lewis, who had no sense of humor at all and doesn't seem to have learned anything at all in the interim. But I think that one has 80 million views now, twice as many as the Kathy Newman interview. Like, it just keeps racking up views. And it was because Helen Lewis, she has like 50 tricks or 100 tricks. Kathy had like 4, and they were pretty blunt. And she had a sense of humor about them. But Helen Lewis, she was just all tricks, and lots of them, and smart, and it's quite something to talk to someone who's quite smart and quite educated, but all tricks.
We'll get back to talking to Jordan in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Element. I've used Element every single morning for over 3 years now. It is the way I start every single day. It tastes fantastic. It optimizes my hydration. It helps to regulate my appetite, and it improves my brain health. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. Best of all, they've got a brand new chocolate caramel flavor, which you can have hot. Hot Element, I hear you say. What sort of hydration blasphemy is this? But no, it tastes fantastic, and on cold mornings, it's perfect. There is a no BS, no questions asked refund policy, so you can buy it and try it completely risk-free. And if you do not like it for any reason, they will give you your money back, and you don't even need to return the box. I've used this every single morning for as long as I can remember, and that orange flavor is phenomenal. Plus, that chocolate caramel is available right now. If you go to the link in the show notes below, or head to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom for a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip with Jordan, you will love the over 3-hour-long podcast episode, which is available right here. Go on. Give it a tap.